Victoria Reynolds stood frozen in her own kitchen on her husband's birthday, the champagne bottle trembling in her hands as Derek's voice cut through the air like a blade. "My mistress deserves to be treated like royalty tonight, so you'll serve us both dinner, understand?" He didn't know that the woman he was humiliating, forcing to serve his mistress Amber at his birthday celebration, was the same woman whose signature would appear on the $750 million deal his company desperately needed to survive. He didn't know that while he paraded his affair partner through their home, his wife owned Mitchell Global Holdings, the corporate giant his bosses had been begging to finalize the contract with for 8 months. But as Victoria watched Amber drape herself over Derek's lap, laughing at inside jokes while being served like royalty by the wife he'd discarded, something crystallized in her mind about what she would do the next day. The question burning through the room wasn't whether Derek would survive the birthday dinner, but whether he would survive what his wife had planned for tomorrow. Would the man who forced his wife to serve his mistress on his birthday ever recover when he discovered the truth? Would the $750 million deal he'd worked on for months become the instrument of his destruction? And what exactly does a woman who owns everything do to the husband who treated her like nothing? Victoria had learned to make herself invisible over the past 2 years. It started small, the way most betrayals do. Derek coming home late, his cologne mixed with unfamiliar perfume. Phone calls he'd take in the other room. Weekend business trips that somehow never required laptop bags. She'd confronted him once, 8 months ago, her voice shaking as she held up the credit card statement showing charges at restaurants she'd never been to, hotels she'd never slept in. He'd laughed, actually laughed. "You're paranoid, Vic. This is why you don't have friends anymore. You see conspiracies everywhere." The gaslighting had been so smooth, so practiced, that she'd almost believed him. Almost. But Victoria Reynolds hadn't built a multi-billion-dollar empire by ignoring patterns. She'd inherited Mitchell Global Holdings from her father, Thomas Mitchell, when she was 26, fresh out of Harvard Business School. The company had been worth $400 million then. Under her leadership over the past 12 years, she'd grown it to $8 billion. She'd done it quietly, using her maiden name professionally, keeping her business life completely separate from her marriage. Derek worked at Hyperion Industries as their director of strategic partnerships. He'd been there for 6 years, climbing the ladder, proud of his accomplishments. He had no idea that the mysterious Mitchell Global Holdings his company was desperately courting was owned by the woman whose credit card paid for his tailored suits. The birthday dinner had been Derek's idea, but the cruelty had been spontaneous. Victoria had been preparing his favorite meal, the braised short ribs he loved when he'd walked in with Amber, not sneaking her in, not hiding, walking in through the front door with his hand on the small of another woman's back, in the home he shared with his wife. "Amber's joining us for dinner," he'd announced, his tone daring Victoria to object. "It's my birthday, and I want the people I care about here." Victoria had stood there, knife in hand, short ribs sizzling in the Dutch oven behind her. She'd looked at Amber, really looked at her. 27, maybe 28, blonde hair in loose waves, the kind that required $200 salon visits to maintain. Designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Confident smile of a woman who believed she'd won. "Hi," Amber had said, her voice saccharine sweet. "Derek's told me so much about you." That's when Derek had given his order. Not a request, an order. "My mistress deserves to be treated like royalty tonight, so you'll serve us both dinner, understand?" Victoria had felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart, that had broken months ago. This was different. This was the sound of her patience shattering. But she'd smiled, she'd nodded, and she'd served them dinner. She'd poured their wine, cleared their plates, brought out the birthday cake she'd spent 3 hours making. She'd watched Amber feed Derek bites of chocolate cake, watched him lick frosting off her fingers while sitting at the table Victoria's grandmother had left her. She'd endured Amber's pitying glances and Derek's satisfied smirk, and she'd planned. Derek didn't know that 3 days ago, Victoria had sat in a conference room on the 47th floor of the Mitchell building downtown, listening to Hyperion Industries' CEO practically beg for the $750 million deal. "Ms. Mitchell, this partnership would transform our company," Gerald Patterson had said. his desperation evident. We've restructured our entire Asian division around the assumption that this contract will close. Our stockholders are expecting the announcement. We're prepared to offer very favorable terms. Victoria had said nothing, just reviewed the contracts her legal team had prepared. The deal was good for both companies. Hyperion would gain access to Mitchell Global's manufacturing network across 14 countries. Mitchell Global would secure a major client for the next decade. It was smart business. But smart business could wait. She'd told Gerald she needed until Monday to make her final decision. He'd agreed, relief flooding his features. Of course. Monday is perfect. I'll have Derek Reynolds, our Director of Strategic Partnerships, standing by. He's been the point person on this deal. Brilliant young man. This will be the crowning achievement of his career. Victoria had smiled at that. Derek had been coming home for months talking about the Mitchell Global deal, about how landing it would mean a promotion to vice president, about how he'd finally be making the kind of money he deserved. He'd been working on the contract for 8 months, ever since Victoria had first allowed Hyperion to submit a proposal. She'd drawn it out deliberately, asking for revision after revision, watching through her assistant as Derek scrambled to meet every demand. She'd wanted to see how hard he'd work for something he wanted. Apparently, he'd worked very hard for career advancement. For his marriage, not so much. The idea had come to her during dessert, watching Amber lick chocolate from Derek's thumb. Victoria had excused herself to the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at her reflection. 38 years old, still beautiful, though the stress of the past 2 years had added lines around her eyes. She'd given up a thriving social life to support Derek's career, had played the perfect corporate wife at endless networking dinners, had subordinated her own needs to his ambitions. And for what? To be humiliated in her own home on his birthday? No, not anymore. She'd pulled out her phone and texted her executive assistant. Contact Gerald Patterson. Tell him I've made my decision on the Hyperion deal. I'll make the announcement personally on Monday morning, 10 a.m., their headquarters. Make sure all key personnel are present, including Derek Reynolds. The response came back within seconds. Confirmed. Anything else? Victoria had stared at her phone for a long moment, then typed, have legal draft termination paperwork. I want the cleanest divorce possible. No negotiation. He gets nothing. When she'd returned to the dining room, Derek and Amber had been kissing, his hands tangled in her blonde hair, completely unconcerned that his wife had left the room. Victoria had cleared the remaining dessert plates without a word, had wished Derek a happy birthday in a voice devoid of emotion, and had gone upstairs to the guest room where she'd been sleeping for the past 3 months. She'd lain awake most of the night, not from anguish, but from anticipation. Years of business negotiations had taught her that timing was everything. Strike too early and your opponent has time to mount a defense. Strike too late and the opportunity passes. But strike at the exact right moment, when they're comfortable and unsuspecting, and you can change everything with a single move. Monday morning would be that moment. Derek would arrive at Hyperion's headquarters expecting the best day of his professional life. The $750 deal he'd worked on for 8 months would finally close. He'd be celebrated, promoted, validated, and Victoria would be there, not as his wife, but as Ms. Mitchell, the CEO he'd never met, the woman who owned the company that owned his future. She'd thought about her father, about the lessons he'd taught her. In business, Victoria, never let emotion cloud judgment, but never forget that business is done by people, and people are emotional creatures. The key is knowing when to be rational and when to make them feel. Tomorrow would be about making Derek feel. Making him feel the weight of what he'd done, making him understand exactly what he'd thrown away. The question that kept her awake wasn't whether she'd go through with it. That decision had been made the moment Derek had called Amber his mistress in Victoria's presence, had forced his wife to serve them like hired help. The question was whether she'd feel satisfaction or emptiness when it was done, whether revenge would heal the wound or just replace one pain with another, but those were questions for later. Right now, she had a contract to finalize and a marriage to end. Morning came slowly. Victoria rose at 5, went for a run through their upscale neighborhood, came back and showered in the guest bathroom. She selected her clothes carefully, a charcoal Armani suit, simple but powerful, pearl earrings, a gift from her father. Her wedding ring stayed on the nightstand. Derek was still asleep when she left. Amber's car still parked in their driveway, like a flag of conquest. Victoria looked at it once, then climbed into her Mercedes and drove downtown to the Mitchell building. Her assistant had everything prepared. The contract, pristine and ready for signatures. The divorce papers, filed and waiting for Derek's response. A press release, scheduled to go out the moment the deal was announced. Victoria reviewed everything twice, her business mind checking each detail. There could be no mistakes. This had to be perfect. At 9:45, her driver took her to Hyperion Industries. The building was smaller than hers, only 30 stories, but impressive enough. Gerald Patterson met her in the lobby personally, his handshake firm and grateful. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you so much for coming here. We're honored to host you for the signing." He'd never met her before. Victoria had always sent representatives to preliminary meetings. Today was the first time anyone at Hyperion would see the face behind Mitchell Global Holdings. They rode the elevator to the executive floor. Gerald made small talk about the partnership, about growth projections, about future possibilities. Victoria nodded politely, her mind elsewhere. The elevator doors opened, and they walked down a corridor toward the main conference room. Through the glass walls, Victoria could see people gathering, executives in expensive suits, board members, department heads. And there, standing near the head of the table, laughing at something a colleague had said, was Derek. He looked happy, confident. This was his moment, his triumph. He'd worn his best suit, the navy Tom Ford she'd bought him for Christmas. His hair was freshly cut. He was standing tall, chest out, already playing the part of the rising executive who'd landed the impossible deal. He had no idea his wife was about to walk through that door. No idea that the mysterious CEO he'd been working to impress for 8 months was the woman he'd humiliated last night. No idea that his entire world was about to implode. Gerald opened the conference room door. "Everyone, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Victoria Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Global Holdings." Victoria stepped into the room, and the world seemed to slow down. She watched Derek's face as recognition hit him, watched the color drain from his skin, watched his confident smile collapse into confusion and then creeping horror. Around him, executives were standing, applauding, moving forward to shake her hand. But Derek was frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with the dawning realization of what was happening. Victoria crossed the room, shook hands with board members, accepted their congratulations, all while moving steadily toward her husband. When she finally reached him, she extended her hand formally. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand you've been the point person on this contract. Excellent work." Her voice was professional, cool, giving nothing away. Derek's hand trembled as he shook hers. "Victoria, I didn't..." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't reconcile the woman before him with the wife he'd ordered to serve his mistress 12 hours ago. "Should we proceed with the signing?" Victoria turned to Gerald, dismissing Derek without another glance. "I have another appointment this morning." The signing took 20 minutes. Victoria sat at the head of the table, Derek 4 seats away, watching her with growing panic. She reviewed each page of the contract carefully, asked clarifying questions, negotiated one minor term that her lawyers had flagged. She was every inch the CEO, commanding the room with quiet authority. When she finally signed her name, cameras flashed. Handshakes were exchanged. Gerald gave a short speech about partnership and growth. Through it all, Derek sat silent, his career-defining moment turning to ash in his mouth. When the formalities ended, Victoria stood. "Gentlemen, thank you for your partnership. I look forward to a productive relationship." She turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something. "Oh, Mr. Reynolds, and could I have a word in private?" Gerald beamed. "Of course, Derek, you lucky man. The CEO wants to personally congratulate you." He gestured to a small office off the conference room. "Please use my office." Victoria walked in first, Derek following like a man approaching his own execution. She closed the door, and the silence between them was deafening. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice hoarse. "You own Mitchell Global Holdings." "I do." "For how long?" 12 years. Since my father died." Derek's legs seemed to give out. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Why didn't you tell me? You never asked about my work. You never asked about the Mitchell building downtown, even though I mentioned it dozens of times. You never wondered how we afforded this lifestyle on your salary. Victoria's voice was calm, factual. You weren't interested in me, Derek. You were interested in what I could do for you. Last night, Derek looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. God, Victoria, last night I didn't know. Would it have mattered if you did? Victoria pulled an envelope from her briefcase. These are divorce papers. My lawyers have been very fair. You'll get exactly what you brought into the marriage. Everything we acquired together, including the house, stays with me since it was purchased with my money. You have 24 hours to sign them and move out. If you contest anything, I'll make sure every company in this city knows exactly what kind of man you are. Derek was shaking now. Please, Victoria, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I love you. We can fix this. You don't love me, Derek. You love what you thought I was. A quiet, supportive wife who'd endure anything to keep her marriage intact. Victoria walked to the door, then turned back. By the way, the promotion Gerald was planning to announce, I requested he postpone it indefinitely. I explained that while your work has been adequate, I need to see evidence of stronger character before trusting you with increased responsibility. He agreed completely. After all, client satisfaction is paramount. She opened the door, and the sound of celebration flooded in from the conference room. Happy birthday, Derek. I hope it was worth it. Victoria walked out of Hyperion Industries with her head high, leaving behind the wreckage of Derek's ambitions and the ghost of who she'd been yesterday. Her phone buzzed with text from her assistant. The press release had gone out. Social media was exploding with news of the deal. Mitchell Global Holding stock had jumped 6%. Everything was perfect, exactly as planned. But as she climbed into her car, Victoria felt the weight of the morning settle over her. She'd won. She'd destroyed Derek's career trajectory, ended their marriage on her terms, and proven she was nobody's victim. So why did she feel so hollow? The satisfaction she'd anticipated was there, but muted, mixed with grief for the years she'd wasted and the marriage she'd believed in. Her driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Back to the office, Ms. Mitchell. Victoria looked out the window at the city passing by. Out there somewhere, Amber was probably texting Derek, wondering why he wasn't responding, not knowing that her relationship with him had just become exponentially more complicated. Out there, Gerald was probably realizing that his Golden Boy employee had somehow spectacularly offended the CEO of his most important client. Out there, Derek was sitting in that office, understanding for the first time what it meant to underestimate someone. Yes, Victoria said finally, back to the office. I have a company to run. Because that was the truth Derek had never understood. Victoria didn't need him. She'd never needed him. She'd wanted a partner, someone to build a life with, but she'd never needed him for anything except companionship and love. And now that those were gone, there was nothing left to tie her to the man who'd forced her to serve his mistress on his birthday. The Mercedes pulled away from Hyperion Industries, carrying Victoria toward her future. Behind her in that conference room, Derek was learning the most expensive lesson of his life. Never humiliate someone whose power you don't understand. The $750 million deal he'd spent 8 months pursuing had just cost him everything that mattered. And somewhere in the universe, her father was probably smiling, proud of the daughter who'd learned his lessons well. In business and in life, timing is everything. And Victoria's timing had been absolutely perfect. 6 months passed like chapters in a book Victoria never planned to write. The divorce was finalized in 8 weeks, the cleanest dissolution her lawyers had ever processed. Derek signed everything without contest, moved his belongings out in a single afternoon while Victoria was at the office, and disappeared from her life as completely as morning fog burns away under sunlight. She heard about him occasionally through industry circles. He still worked at Hyperion Industries, but the promotion never materialized. Gerald Patterson had quietly reassigned him to domestic accounts, keeping him far away from the Mitchell Global relationship. Amber had left him 3 weeks after the signing, once she realized that dating a man whose wife owned billions was very different from dating a man whose wife owned nothing. Last Victoria heard, Derek was seeing a therapist, trying to understand how he'd destroyed the best thing in his life through arrogance and entitlement. Victoria didn't take pleasure in his struggles. That surprised her. She'd expected vindication to taste sweeter, for revenge to fill the hollow spaces his betrayal had carved out. Instead, she felt something closer to peace, not the peace of victory, but the peace of truth. She'd spent 2 years making herself smaller to accommodate Derek's ego, dimming her own light so he could feel like he shined brighter. The exhaustion of that pretense had been slowly killing her, and she hadn't even realized it until she stopped. The Mitchell Global Holdings continued to thrive. The Hyperion deal opened doors to 3 additional partnerships, expanding her company into markets she'd been targeting for years. Her executive team, who'd always known about her marriage troubles even when she tried to hide them, watched her transform back into the focused, innovative leader she'd been before. Derek's insecurity had begun poisoning her confidence. "You're different now," her CFO told her over coffee one morning. "Sharper, like you've remembered who you are." Victoria had smiled at that because it was true. She'd remembered that she was Thomas Mitchell's daughter, a woman who'd built an empire through intelligence and integrity. She'd remembered that her worth wasn't determined by whether someone chose to value her, but by how she valued herself. Most importantly, she'd remembered that teaching people how to treat you starts with refusing to accept treatment you don't deserve. She thought about Amber sometimes, wondering if the younger woman understood yet what she'd been part of. Probably not. Some people go through life never questioning whether the version of events they're told matches reality. Amber had believed Derek's narrative about his unhappy marriage to a cold, distant wife who didn't understand him. She'd never asked why a woman described as cold and distant would spend 3 hours baking a birthday cake for her husband. She'd never questioned why a marriage so dead still had family photos on every wall, fresh flowers in every room, and all the small signs of someone trying very hard to make a home feel like love. But that wasn't Victoria's responsibility anymore. She'd learned that you can't force people to see what they're determined to ignore. You can only control your own actions, your own boundaries, your own self-respect. The house felt different now. Victoria had redecorated, removing all traces of Derek's presence and replacing them with art she'd always loved, but had been told was too bold, too expensive, too much. She'd converted his home office into a library, filling the shelves with first editions and rare books she'd been collecting since college. She'd started hosting dinner parties again, reconnecting with friends she'd neglected while trying to save a marriage that one person can't save alone. Slowly, room by room, decision by decision, she was reclaiming her life. On a cool evening in late autumn, Victoria stood in her kitchen making braised short ribs, not because anyone had requested them, but because she wanted them. As she worked, she thought about that birthday dinner 6 months ago, about standing in this same spot feeling invisible and powerless. She thought about the woman she'd been then, so desperate to hold on to a relationship that she'd accepted humiliation as the price of keeping it. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone stronger, not because she destroyed Derek, but because she'd finally chosen herself. The signing at Hyperion hadn't been about revenge, though it had looked like it from the outside. It had been about reclaiming her power, about refusing to let someone else's disrespect define her worth. Derek's downfall hadn't been her goal. It had simply been the natural consequence of his own choices meeting reality. Her phone buzzed with a text from her executive assistant. Another company wanted to pitch a partnership, another opportunity born from the success of the Hyperion deal. Victoria smiled, typed a quick response scheduling the meeting, and returned to her cooking. The short ribs were perfect, the sauce rich and complex, improved by time and patience. Just like her. The story of Victoria Reynolds teaches us profound truths about self-worth, boundaries, and the consequences of taking people for granted. First and most importantly, never diminish yourself to make someone else feel bigger. Victoria spent years hiding her success, making herself smaller, accommodating Derek's insecurities, and it nearly cost her everything. Your light doesn't burn brighter by dimming it for others. It just means everyone lives in unnecessary darkness. Second, people will treat you exactly how you teach them you'll accept being treated. When Victoria accepted Derek's first acts of disrespect without consequence, She inadvertently gave him permission to escalate. Boundaries aren't cruel, they're essential. They tell the world and yourself what you will and won't tolerate. Without them, you become a doormat, and even good people will eventually wipe their feet on you. Third, never underestimate anyone, especially those you claim to love. Derek's fatal mistake wasn't just the affair. It was his assumption that Victoria was powerless because she'd chosen to be supportive. He confused kindness with weakness, patience with stupidity. He never bothered to truly see his wife because he was too focused on his own ambitions. That blindness cost him everything. Fourth, timing and discretion have power. Victoria didn't lash out emotionally when she discovered the affair. She didn't scream or throw things or make empty threats. She quietly gathered information, made strategic decisions, and struck at the moment of maximum impact. There's wisdom in stepping back, assessing the situation, and responding rather than reacting. Emotion is valid, but strategy is effective. Fifth, revenge is hollow without self-reclamation. Victoria's satisfaction didn't come from destroying Derek's career. It came from rediscovering herself. If she'd focused only on hurting him, she'd have remained trapped in his orbit, defined by their relationship even after it ended. True freedom came when she shifted her focus from what he'd taken to what she was building. Finally know your worth before someone else tries to define it for you. Victoria's power wasn't granted by the $750 million deal or her company's success. Those were just manifestations of a worth she possessed inherently. When you know who you are and what you bring to the table, nobody can convince you to accept crumbs while they feast on your value. If Victoria's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, taken for granted, or made invisible by someone who should have seen your worth, I want you to do something right now. Hit that like button, because this story needs to reach everyone who's ever been treated as less than they are. Someone in your life needs to hear this message today. Share this video with them. It might be the wake-up call that changes everything. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you and lived to regret it? Or are you currently making yourself smaller for someone else? Share your story. This community is here to support you, remind you of your worth, and celebrate when you finally choose yourself. And here's the most important thing. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because I'm bringing you more stories about people who refuse to stay down, who recognize their power, and who rewrote their narratives on their own terms. These aren't just stories. They're reminders that you're stronger than whatever is trying to diminish you. Remember, nobody can make you feel inferior without your permission. Nobody can take your power unless you hand it to them, and it's never too late to take it back. Victoria waited 2 years, but when she moved decisively. Your moment is coming. Be ready. Now go out there and reclaim whatever you've been letting someone else hold hostage. Your power, your peace, your worth, it was always yours. Time to act like it. I'll see you in the next one. Stay strong, stay strategic, and never ever let anyone force you to serve at a table where you should be seated and respected.